I'm amazed to see so many of you here tonight, given that yesterday was such bad weather. Yeah, I don't know how you found parking around here, but somehow you managed, which is amazing. It always amazes me when people come out to BU for these special events, but they do, and I'm so delighted to welcome you here on behalf of the Elie Wiesel Center for Jewish Studies, on behalf of the College of Arts and Sciences, on behalf of Boston University, to a night of consideration of a very important subject that interests all of us vitally, and that is the role of the United States in the Middle East today. And we are very pleased that Senator George Mitchell is joining us tonight as our featured Yitzhak Rabin Memorial Speaker 2018. So help me welcome our main speaker, George Mitchell. Not yet, not yet. So he won't get up quite yet because he needs to be properly introduced. And before I call on Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, Ann Cudd, to do so, I just want to thank everybody who was of such vital importance in making this event happen, the staff and all the good people at the Elie Wiesel Center for Jewish Studies, the colleagues from alumni relations, and last but not least, Mr. Jonathan Krivine, my good friend here in the first row, who has been not just an ardent supporter of the Yitzhak Rabin Memorial Lecture. He really brought it to us. It was his idea. He said, here, I give you some money, make something of it, bring some interesting people, make it relevant, and we're doing that. But he's doing more than that. He's more than just a gadfly and a supporter. He is really a friend of the Center for Jewish Studies. He calls me up in the middle of the night and says, hey, I had an idea. Why don't you do such and such and so and so? And it's a joy to have you as part of our team. So thank you, Jonathan, so much. And now it's time to invite Ann Cudd to give some words of introduction for our main speaker. Thank you, Ann.
Thank you, Michael. So welcome to the 4th annual Yitzhak Rabin Memorial Lecture, which this year is featuring former U.S. Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell. My name's Ann Cudd, as Michael said, and I serve Boston University as the Dean of Arts and Sciences. And it's my pleasure and my honor to introduce our esteemed guest for what I'm sure will be a very stimulating conversation on conflict resolution, negotiation, and a perspective on the United States and its role in the Middle East. But before I do, I also want to thank Jonathan Krivine because he is such a wonderfully enthusiastic and energetic alum, and I'm very grateful for your energy as well. So George Mitchell served as U.S. Special Envoy for the Middle East from January 2009 to May 2011. Prior to that, he had a distinguished career in public service. He was appointed to the United States Senate in 1980 to complete the unexpired term of Senator Edmund S. Muskie, who resigned to become Secretary of State. He was elected to a full term in the Senate in 1982. Senator Mitchell went on to an illustrious career in the Senate, spanning 15 years. He left the Senate in 1995 as a Senate Majority Leader. He reminded me that the Senate Minority Leader at the time was Bob Dole, and Bob Dole was somebody that I got to know in Kansas when I lived there, and I'm looking forward to asking Senator Mitchell a little bit about that relationship later this evening. Senator Mitchell enjoyed bipartisan respect during his tenure. It's been said that there is not a man, woman, or child in the Capitol who does not trust George Mitchell. For 6 consecutive years, he was voted the most respected member of the Senate by a bipartisan group of senior congressional aides. While in the Senate, as I'm sure you all know, he served on many committees. He led a lot of very important legislation on pollution, on the Clean Air Act, for example. He led the Senate to the passage of the nation's first child care bill, and he was a principal author of a low-income housing bill as well. He was also instrumental in the passage of the Americans for Disabilities Act, which was landmark legislation that extended civil rights protections to the disabled. Senator Mitchell's efforts led to the passage of a higher education bill that expanded opportunities for millions of Americans. He was a leader in opening markets to trade and led the Senate to the ratification of the North American Free Trade Agreement and also the creation of the World Trade Organization. Senator Mitchell received his bachelor's degree from Bowdoin College, and he also received a law degree from Georgetown University Law Center. In 1995, he served as special advisor to President William J. Clinton on Ireland. And from 1996 to 2000, he served as the independent chairman of the Northern Ireland peace talks. Under his leadership, of course, the Good Friday Agreement, which was a historic accord, was signed, and it was agreed to by the governments of Ireland and the United Kingdom, as well as the political parties of Northern Ireland. For his service in Northern Ireland, Senator Mitchell received, among other awards, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is the highest honor, civilian honor, given by the United States. In 2000 and 2001, at the request of President Clinton, Prime Minister Ehud Barak, and Chairman Yasser Arafat, Senator Mitchell served as the chairman of the International Fact-Finding Committee on Violence in the Middle East. The committee's recommendation, which is widely known as the Mitchell Report, was endorsed by the Bush administration, the European Union, and by many other governments. Senator Mitchell has served on numerous corporate boards as well, including our beloved Boston Red Sox, and has served for 10 years as the Chancellor of Queen's University in Northern Ireland, as the President of the Economic Club of Washington, and the Chairman of the International Crisis Group. Senator Mitchell will be joined by Professor Adil Najam tonight after Senator Mitchell makes some initial remarks. And Dr. Najam is the inaugural dean of the Frederick S. Pardee School of Global Studies here at Boston University, which was founded in 2014 with a generous gift from a BU alumnus, Frederick S. Pardee. Dr. Najam is also Professor of International Relations and Earth and Environment. In addition to Boston University, Professor Najam has taught at MIT and the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, Tufts University. His research focuses on global public policy, especially those related to global climate change, to South Asia, to Muslim countries, environment and development, and human development. Dr. Najam has written over 100 scholarly papers and book chapters and is widely honored, including by MIT's Goodwin Medal for Effective Teaching and other important awards. So please join me in welcoming the Honorable George J. Mitchell to the podium.
Well, thank you very much, Dean, for your very generous introduction. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your warm reception and for giving me the opportunity to be with you this evening. I join the Dean in thanking Jonathan Rabin. I spoke at an event in New York some time ago, and this guy walked up to me afterward and said, "You should speak at Boston University." It took a while, but I finally made it here. I don't know Jonathan very well, but he seems to be a doer of good deeds, so join me in thanking Jonathan for his support for this whole effort. There are a lot of strange coincidences in life. This event was scheduled many months ago, but last weekend at my home in New York, my wife and I and my daughter, who is in high school, had a celebration because my daughter's best friend, who's graduating from high school, had just been admitted and accepted Boston University. So without knowing that this was going to happen, that happened on a separate track, but just a week ago we had tea and cake and candles and everything celebrating Carrie Messina's entry into Boston University. So keep that name in mind. I speak often, and I'll be frank with you, for me, the highlight of the evening is the introduction. It's always nice to hear good things said about you. When you're the speaker, people rarely ever insult or criticize you, especially in a group of mostly strangers. There is, of course, a risk associated with it. You hear this stuff often enough, you may begin to believe it. So I like to begin with a story and an occasion on which I was brought back down to earth. As the dean indicated, I spent about 5 years working on the peace process in Northern Ireland. And I'm pleased to say that next month, April 10th, we'll celebrate the 20th anniversary of the peace agreement that was reached there in April of 1998. Thank you. When we finished, I came back to the U.S., to my home in Maine, and I wrote a book about my experience there. When it was published, I went on a book tour promoting sales of the book around the country. I received many invitations, and I learned in the process the interesting fact that in the United States, there are more Irish American organizations than there are Irish Americans. And every one of them invited me to come. Literally hundreds. I couldn't go to them all, but I did go to several. And as I traveled the country speaking at these Irish American events, they developed among them an informal competition as to who could give the longest, most fantastic, sometimes truly quite ridiculous introductions of me. The proper reaction, of course, would have been for me to show some humility, to ask them please to keep it short. But I had an improper reaction. I loved it. I encouraged them. I scolded them when they left something out. In Chicago, there was a huge crowd, and a guy got up and literally for 35 minutes read a list of everything I had done in my life, which to me was quite interesting because a lot of it I'd not been aware of until I heard him recite it. So by the time I got to the last stop, which was in Stamford, Connecticut, I was overly impressed with myself. I had a hard time squeezing my head through the front door. When I get in, the first person I encountered was an elderly woman who rushed over, almost knocked me over, very excited and nervous, shook my hand vigorously, held on to it for a long time, spent several minutes telling me what a great guy I am and all that I've done it all. And then she said, I don't live anywhere near here. I drove 3.5 hours across the whole state of Connecticut just to come here and tell you how much I admire you and ask you, please, will you autograph my poster? And I said, well, sure, of course. And so she handed me a poster with a pen. I looked at it. I said, I'm happy to sign it, but before I do, I think there's something I should tell you. She said, what is it? I said, I'm not Henry Kissinger. She said, you're not? Well, who are you anyway? And when I told her, she said, why, that's just terrible. She said, I drove 3.5 hours to meet a great man like Kissinger, and all I've got is a nobody like you. I said, well, I'm sorry you feel so bad. I wish there's something I could do to make you feel better. And after a moment, she said, well, there is. When I asked what it was, she leaned forward, I leaned forward. We were kind of in a conspiratorial crouch. And she said, nobody will ever know the difference. She said, would you mind signing Henry Kissinger's name to my poster? So I did. And it's hanging in Eastern Connecticut in her living room wall, a daily reminder to enjoy these introductions, but don't take them too seriously. Now, here's the best part for those of you who might know Kissinger. A couple of years ago, I've appeared jointly with him on several occasions, and on this occasion, we appeared at a business conference at an Manhattan at a private club. You had to go up the elevator. And we had a moderator. There were two of us and a moderator. We answered questions about China and the world. And I thought it'd be a good time to tell the story I just told, which I did. Crowd laughed and loved it. He seemed to enjoy it. We went on with the program. Afterward, we found ourselves in the elevator going down to the ground floor together. And Henry said to me, he said, "I've heard you speak often when you were Senate Majority Leader. We've appeared together." He said, "But I have to tell you, I never heard you speak as well and as brilliantly as you did tonight." And I said, "Really?" I said, "Well, that's very flattering coming from someone as famous as you and prominent." I said, "Was it my answer on China or the Middle East?" "No, no, no." He said, "It was that story you told in the beginning." He said, "That was really great. You should tell it all over America." So I have, and I keep a list, which Boston University is now on. Whenever I see them, I say, "Well, here's where I'm spreading the word about you." So I'm glad you enjoyed it. Well, let me say some serious words, beginning with telling you that it's an honor for me to be here at the Yitzhak Rabin Memorial Lecture. Rabin was one of the towering political figures of the 20th century. He joined what would later become the Israel Defense Forces while he was still in his teens. Over the next 3 decades, he participated in the crucial battles that led to the creation of the modern state of Israel, rising to become the chief of the general staff. He then served in a number of high-level offices, including ambassador to the United States, and culminating, of course, as prime minister. He was a tough and effective military leader while in the IDF. He was also a man of peace as the prime minister. He brought to both roles intelligence, decisiveness, and courage. In his second term as prime minister, he signed the Oslo Accords with the Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat, for which he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And that act also cost him his life. On November 4th, 1995, after he spoke to a large crowd at a rally in Tel Aviv, he was shot in the back and killed by an Israeli who opposed the Oslo Accords. I first met Rabin when he served as the Minister of Defense. Later, when he was Prime Minister and I was the Senate Majority Leader, we met often, and I hosted him on his visits to the Capitol and to his meetings with senators. I was honored to work with him and proud toward the end of my time in the Senate to call him a friend. We can only speculate on what a different turn history might have taken had he not been assassinated. But we must deal with the Middle East and the rest of the world as it is, not as it might have been or as we wish it to be. And I'd like to speak to that now. The subject, of course, is vast and complicated, impossible to cover in depth in the remarks of a few minutes. So my comments will be general, but I'll be happy to get specific in the question and answer period after I talk. It's common today to hear and read in our country and in others that the world is falling apart, that it's more dangerous than ever, and that the United States is in decline at home and abroad. I disagree. Fear of the future, complaining about current events, is as old as human civilization. Some of you here tonight, I can see there's a few gray hairs like mine, will recall 1968 in the United States. The Vietnam War was raging. President Johnson withdrew. Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy were assassinated, and riots tore through many cities in what, to those of us who lived through it, seemed like an endless summer. There may be even a few here who recall the Great Depression, when unemployment in our country reached nearly 25%. 1 in every 4 Americans of working age was unemployed, and a frightened nation struggled to survive. Or you can go all the way back to 500 years before the birth of Christ. The word democracy is derived from 2 Greek words: demos, the people; kratzi, the rule of. It came into existence over a period of hundreds of years when the great Greek city-states went through a slow transition from dictatorship to oligarchy to a rudimentary form of democracy. In the year 550 BC, a member of a family of oligarchs which ruled a Greek city-state wrote, "Gone is faith. No one any longer reveres God. The generation of religious men is no more." Those words sound like some current comments about the loss of traditional values. And that ancient author was deeply troubled by the idea that ordinary citizens would be able to share in the governance of their society. Democracy at the outset was seen as a radical departure from past tradition and a danger to the whole society. Today, 2,500 years later, democracy still faces challenge, and the world is still a dangerous place. In the 20th century, an estimated 100 million people were killed in wars in a world in which the population was, for much of the century, about a third of what it is today. A comparable figure in the 21st century would be 300 million killed. Each death in conflict is, of course, a tragedy to those who lived through it and survived. In the 20th century and before, there were many days in which the deaths were in hundreds, the thousands, even the tens of thousands. That could happen again if another world war erupts. But that is not likely in the foreseeable future, largely because of the overwhelming military dominance of the United States and its allies. Although no worldwide war is likely, local and regional conflicts will continue, probably increase, as I'll describe in a moment, with devastating impacts on those who are directly affected. In the coming decades, it will become increasingly clear that the long period of relative stability that followed the Second World War has largely come to an end. Throughout history, many conflicts involved religious differences, and they tend to get emphasis, but there have always been other factors as well. As Pope Francis recently noted in a speech, the drive for political power has often been disguised by ambitious leaders as a religious endeavor. Today, across a wide swath of the globe, from South Asia to the Indian subcontinent, from the Middle East and all across Africa, populations will grow very rapidly in the coming decades. The single most important factor in population growth is the status of women. Where women are independent and fully empowered, population rates tend to stabilize unless increased by immigration. Where women are not independent and empowered, populations grow very rapidly. Much of the growth in the next few decades will take place in countries already not able to meet the basic needs of their people, many struggling with widespread corruption and the absence of an effective rule of law, which tend to go hand in hand in difficult times and areas. The political history of the Middle East provides some insight into recent and potential problems. For about 425 years, what we now call the Middle East was dominated and ruled by the Ottoman Empire based in Turkey. When that empire collapsed in the aftermath of the First World War, Britain and France, both then still in imperialist modes, effectively divided up control of the region. Some of the political boundaries they created did not reflect the history or the interests of the people who actually lived there. That order lasted nearly a century, but is now collapsed under the weight of dissatisfaction, mistrust, and extensive violence. All of these factors are intensified by religious differences. Islam is now torn by internal conflict, some of which overlap and intersect. Some date from the colonial and the post-World War I periods. Others go all the way back to the 7th century and the political competition to succeed the Prophet Muhammad. And I emphasize that was not a religious contest. On the Prophet's death, two competing groups fought over several decades for control. And the prevailing group became the Sunni. The defeated group became the Shia. That division has been marked by alternating periods of remission and violent expansion for 1,400 years. It is now intense and expanding. Saudi Arabia and Iran, the leaders of the two groups, are increasingly hostile. Conflicts in Iraq, in Syria, and Yemen have inflamed the division with catastrophic consequences for the people of those countries. Radical extremists like ISIS sought to impose a rigid form of Islam as they claim it was practiced during the life of the Prophet Muhammad in the 7th century. Thus, the emphasis on beheadings, crucifixion, and the acceptance of slavery. Of course, all of those were widely accepted throughout the world at that time, not just within Islam. One result of all this tumult has been massive upheaval in the region and the greatest movement of people across national borders since the Second World War. But as the flood of immigrants from the Middle East and from Africa demonstrates, what most people there want is what most people everywhere want: a stable and secure society, a decent job, a home, and especially the chance to get their children off to a good start in life. The current upheaval is, unfortunately, I believe, likely to continue for decades, and in all probability will have uneven results. The Arab Spring, which seems so promising, has been disappointing to many, but there are some exceptions. In Tunisia, democracy has a fragile foothold. In Morocco, the royal family is charting a course for what they call democratization within monarchy. To those in the West who are impatient or condescending over the pace of change in the Middle East and the level of violence there, we should not forget that Europe was shaped by centuries of bitter, violent, and sectarian conflict. In France, more than a half-century elapsed from the time of revolution to the modern republic. In England, hundreds of years. The United States has treaties with countries all around the world. Among our commitments in the Middle East is to guarantee Israel's right to exist within safe and defensible borders, a commitment that is unshakable whoever occupies the leadership of both countries. The United States also supports the creation of an independent Palestinian state under which the Palestinian people can have the right and dignity of self-governance. In January of 2008, President George W. Bush traveled to Jerusalem where he met with the leaders of both societies. And in a speech at the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, he set forth the United States policy. I will quote briefly from the substance of his remarks. The point of departure for permanent status negotiations is clear. There should be an end to the occupation that began in 1967. The agreement must establish Palestine as a homeland for the Palestinian people, just as Israel is a homeland for the Jewish people. These negotiations must ensure that Israel has secure, recognized, and defensible borders. And they must ensure that the state of Palestine is viable, contiguous, sovereign, and independent. It is vital that each side understands that satisfying the other's fundamental objective is key to a successful agreement. Security for Israel and viability for the Palestinian state are in the mutual interests of both parties. That's the end of the quotation. Israel has reached peace agreements with Egypt and Jordan, both of which have endured for decades. The policy of the United States is that an agreement between Israelis and Palestinians would be beneficial to both, although it is clear that there are many in both societies and growing numbers in the United States who oppose a two-state solution. One beneficial result of an agreement with the Palestinians would be to remove a major obstacle to the normalization of relations between Israel and the Gulf Arab states, with whom they share a fear of Iran and its intentions. The Middle East is and always has been deeply complex. Consider, if you will, the tangle of American relationships there. We oppose the Assad regime in Syria, but we also oppose ISIS, which is fighting against the Assad regime. The Syrian Kurds join us in opposing ISIS, but the Kurds are being attacked by Turkey, one of our allies. We also combat ISIS in Iraq, where we are joined by Shia militias who are supported by Iran, who we oppose. In Afghanistan, we oppose the Taliban, who receive some support from Pakistan, one of our allies. Pakistan, meanwhile, has fought several wars with India, another of our allies. We are closely allied with Israel, but we also are allied with many Arab and Muslim countries. For decades, the United States has had close relationships with Morocco, Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, the United Arab Emirates, Indonesia, and many others. Of the approximately 7.5 billion people on Earth today, about 1 in 4, or about 1.8 billion, are Muslim. Sometime after mid-century, the total population of the world will reach between 9.5 and 10 billion, and by then, 1 in 3 will be Muslim. To put that into perspective, 3 billion was the total world population as recently as 1960. So in the 21st century, what happens in the Muslim world will affect everyone, in particular the dominant world power, the United States. We have a clear and compelling interest in remaining involved in the Middle East and in doing all we can to help reduce violence and upheaval, to encourage open and stable societies. Inevitably, there will be many more years of disruption, and no single policy, no single action can solve all of the region's problems. But a peaceful resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict would be a highly significant and symbolic step that might enable some of the countries, particularly Israel and Saudi Arabia, who already have quiet, out of public eye contacts. It would enable them to cooperate more effectively and publicly in opposing what both regard as their common foes, Iran and those terrorist organizations, some supported by Iran, many of them, in fact, opposed to Iran. Now, there is obviously little reason to be optimistic at this time about an early resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. As I indicated earlier, support for the two-state solution is declining in both societies. And my hope is that the Israelis and Palestinians will weigh the risks of delay in an action against the benefits of an agreement, however imperfect. I wrote a book last year on this subject entitled A Path to Peace, which was intended primarily to support the two-state solution, and in which I and my co-author argue that while it is subject to reasonable criticism, and one can rationally argue since it has not been obtained in many decades, it is impossible to obtain, but at the same time one can also argue, as we did, that there is no other alternative that is more feasible or credible. I believe it's important for the United States to try to help create the right incentives to encourage Israelis and Palestinians to enter serious negotiations and reach an agreement. From my experience in Northern Ireland, I reached the conclusion that there's no such thing as a conflict that can't be ended. Conflicts are created, conducted, sustained by human beings. They can be ended by human beings. Having spent 5 years working on the peace process in Northern Ireland, I recognize the daunting difficulties in the Middle East, and I have done 2 tours of duty there over several years. And I'm mindful of the conflicts and the complexity of the region that work against an early resolution. I think it's very important to view the Israeli-Palestinian conflict not in isolation to the events in the surrounding area, but in the context of that, because the two interact in influencing each other. The relations between Israelis and Palestinians are affected by what goes on in the surrounding countries, and that relationship in turn affects those events. But I firmly believe that there is a path to peace through a two-state solution. And I also believe that all of us who care about the region and its people, in particular, the people of Israel and the Palestinians, must do whatever we can to advocate, work for, and support an end to the conflict. Thank you all very much, and I'll be pleased now to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Senator. Thank you
Okay.
so much for those wonderful remarks and for an overview of a very complex region in a very complex time. We will open up for questions in just a minute, but I'll use this great honor and privilege of being here with you. Senator, if President Trump were to call you, he's in the process of realigning his team. And if he were to call you and ask you for advice on the Middle East, what would you say to him, sir?
Well, first off, you've begun the questioning with a fantasy. It's not going to happen, but I'm happy to tell you what I would tell him. That I'll repeat some of what I said here. If you ask people in both societies or their leaders, do you want peace?
Meaning Israel and Palestine.
Israelis and Palestinians. Virtually everyone says yes. So the problem is not people wanting peace. The problem is on what terms do they want peace? And can the differences in the terms in the respective societies be reconciled? I believe they can. Before he left office, President Clinton made a speech to a group called the Israel Policy Forum in New York, in which he laid out the terms that he had described to the two parties just before he left office. They have survived, known as the Clinton parameters, and they describe roughly the terms that he thought would do the job. In the speech that I quoted from, President Bush laid out similar terms, but he also issued, prior to that, a very detailed written plan called his roadmap to peace. If you then study the negotiations that occurred roughly for about a year, a little over a year, before President Obama took office, during the closing year of the Bush presidency, which came to be known as the Annapolis process, during which there were very detailed negotiations between President Abbas and then President Ehud Olmert, and in parallel between the foreign and prime ministers, Tzipi Livni for the Israelis and Abu Ala for the Palestinians. If you put those all together, you see what I think is roughly the outlines of what would be an acceptable agreement. And I personally believe that's the way it's going to end. The difficulty has been that it is extremely difficult to pursue an objective that roughly half of the public in both societies does not support. And as I noted in my remarks, support for the two-state solution has been steadily declining. Within Israel, the right is ascendant, and although the prime minister says he's for the two-state solution, he has in the past been against it. And his own party and members of his governing coalition are openly opposed to it, who publicly, strongly urge that there never be a Palestinian state on the West Bank. On the Palestinian side, the society is roughly divided, again, in half. The Hamas controls Gaza, although not everybody in Gaza supports Hamas, and the Palestinian Authority controls the West Bank, although not everybody on the West Bank supports the Palestinian Authority. In order for a political leader to enter into what will be painful and difficult negotiations, during which it will be necessary to make concessions that will be fiercely opposed by half of your public, you have to have some confidence, some feeling that it's going to work. And as I have said publicly, and as I said in my book, what I'm about to say, what I've said until now is fact, what I'm about to say is speculation. But I spent dozens and dozens and dozens of hours with Prime Minister Netanyahu in Jerusalem and with President Abbas in Ramallah. It is my view that neither of them is willing to engage seriously for the simple reason that they don't think it will work because of the other guy. Prime Minister Netanyahu believes that President Abbas has neither the personal or political strength to enter into an agreement that would be acceptable to Israel, and no strength to get it approved by the Palestinian people.
By the other guy, you mean the other guy?
Netanyahu believes that Abbas does not have the personal political strength to reach the kind of agreement needed, to make the kind of concessions needed. And therefore, he does not believe the negotiation would succeed. And if you don't believe it's going to succeed, you're not going to take political risks and subject yourself to ferocious criticism and possibly the loss of office. On the other side, Abbas reaches the same conclusion for a slightly different reason. He doesn't believe a word Netanyahu says. He just simply thinks that he's not sincere, and he cites Netanyahu's record. He first was opposed to the two-state, then he was for it, then he was against it, then he was for it. And there are many statements made that caused it. So he doesn't want to enter negotiations in which he has to make painful concessions. And they will be painful on both sides. The only way it can happen. I think what has to happen is either they must become convinced or other leaders come on and become convinced that despite the enormous risk of an agreement, and this is particularly true of Israel, despite the enormous risk, the risks are greater in the absence of an agreement. This is the argument I made to Netanyahu.
In this analysis of the two sides, where do you see the third party in our title, the US? The quote you had from President Bush's speech, do you think that that is still the fundamental US policy and interest, security for Israel, viability for a Palestinian state?
Right.
Or has that also shifted either in reality or in the minds of the major parties in the Middle East?
Well, first off, we have not yet seen President Trump's plan. It is quite clear, based upon the statements that he's made, that he does not have the same level of belief and commitment to the two-state solution as did President Bush, President Obama, and President Clinton. But he has not ruled it out. I hope that his plan will create some incentives for the two sides. In my book, I set forth, I describe my opposition to the arguments made on both sides to cut the others off. Every Arab leader I talk to says, oh, you Americans can solve this problem tomorrow if you just cut off aid to Israel. You give them billions of dollars and all these armaments. They can't survive without you. Cut off aid and then they'll come around. The Israelis, on the other hand, from the prime minister on down, said exactly the same thing in reverse. The Palestinians are completely dependent on you Americans. If you just cut off aid to them, they'll be forced to do whatever you tell them. I believe that won't work in either case. They're both proud people. They have their own sense of independence. They're not going to act under duress from the United States. Look, Israel does get a lot of assistance from the United States, but it has a spectacular economy, growing rapidly, a highly successful state, and the amount we give them, while substantial, is increasingly a smaller and smaller share of their defense budget and their economy. They could do very well without us and maintain their dominant military status in the region. What we should do is not to threaten them, but to encourage them with incentives, which I think we can do. I won't get into them all, they're laid out in my book. The same with the Palestinians. They've lived through 70 years of occupation, of deep distress for their people, particularly in Gaza now. And they can live through another 70 years. They're not going to be persuaded by the tactic of cutting them off. What we have to do is create incentives for them. In the event, we have to create a mechanism to encourage them to reach an agreement that will lead them to say it's going to lead to better things, not worse. I don't know what the president's plan is going to include. I hope it includes incentives and it tries to get them together, although I'm frank to say I think the statements he's made so far are not encouraging in terms of bringing the parties together. I'll just comment, if I can, because it's bound to be asked about his action on Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. I've been asked about that, and here's my answer. There is no doubt in anybody's mind, in the Middle East or elsewhere, that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. It has been, it is, it's going to be. There's no doubt about that. So in a sense, the president simply reaffirmed a fact. However, there is a doubt about whether there will ever be a Palestinian capital in East Jerusalem of a Palestinian state. And in making his statement on Jerusalem, which I believe, as did President Obama, Bush, and Clinton, that it was premature and unwise, what it did was it made less likely a negotiation and a two-state solution, which is what our policy is. In other words, we have undermined our own policy by making it less likely that the parties will get into negotiations, and if they do, whether they will reach an agreement.
I want to open up but one more. It's difficult to hold to hope generally, but with you it's a little easier, because I remember the time when Ireland seemed like an impossible, and we stand now at the 20th, or nearly at the threshold of the 20th anniversary. What is, in your mind, similar between Ireland and the Middle East in general, or
yes.
Israel and Palestine, and what is not?
Well, the obvious similarities are, as with many such conflicts, and I was involved in the Balkans very deeply while I was a Senate Majority Leader, there are religious differences, there are territorial disputes, different people claiming the same territory, there are national disputes of national identity. I think the differences are much greater.
The differences between the two cases or differences between the two people?
In both. About a year ago, I spoke to a very large crowd of thousands of Irish Americans in New York City. And I said to them, I'm about to say something I never thought I would think, let alone say publicly. I spent 5 years in Northern Ireland. It was really tough. It made my work as Senate Majority Leader look like child's play, and that was really tough. And then I went to the Middle East, and I spent 6 months with the Israelis and the Arabs, and I thought the Irish were a bunch of patsies. They were really easy to deal with. The Middle East is far more complicated, far more difficult. There are external factors which didn't exist. Ireland and England are out there by themselves in the North Sea.
The geography itself is...
Geography, you go, and many of you have been to Israel. It's tiny. The threat is right around the corner. And look what's around the corner, the conflict in Syria, the conflict in Iraq. So you can't just view that in isolation. There is a tremendous interactive effect with what is going on in the region. So it is far more difficult. And I'll close with one humorous comment. At the request of then President Peres, I delivered, it was similar to this, marking an Israeli event. I gave a speech in Jerusalem to a very large crowd. And in the course of question and answer, I was asked about Northern Ireland. And I commented offhand that the peace agreement in Northern Ireland was achieved 800 years after the British domination of Ireland began. So when I finished...
It's not a hopeful comment.
Yeah, no. So, but when I walked down off the stage, often happens, a group of people gathered. Some people wanted a picture, wanted to ask a question, wanted to criticize me. This elderly guy with a cane and a hearing aid yells out to me, "Senator, did you say 800 years? And I said, yes, 800 years, yelling louder than I usually do. He said, 800 years? I said, yes, 800. He said, no wonder you solved this, such a recent argument. Only in the Middle East can 800 years be regarded as, but in fact, they do make arguments going back thousands of years. You go on both sides, they'll give you historical tracts and show you maps and go back 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years. So it's a very deeply rooted conflict, and it has a lot more complicating factors than was the case in Northern Ireland.
Indeed. History is always more recent in the Middle East than just about anywhere else. We will open up for a few questions, if it's okay with you.
Sure.
We'll take 2 or 3 together and then come
Any
back.
as you want.
Yeah. Do we have a mic or something? Or we have a mic right there. So can we start with Dean Cudd, just because I need to keep my job?
Yeah.
You're doing a great job now, Adil, so thank you. This has been great. I wanted to ask you a little bit about U.S. politics as well.
Yeah.
So you were the Senate Majority Leader, and as I mentioned, I spent a long time in Kansas, and Bob Dole is a great hero there. But his politics, of course, are very different from yours. But it seems like that was a time when in American politics, you could work across the aisle and you could get great things done, like the Americans for Disabilities Act and things like that.
Yeah.
What do you think are the prospects for a future of more conciliatory work across the aisle? And what do you think made that work at that time?
Yeah.
Can we take just a couple more, or?
Take all you want.
We'll take 2 more and come back, and you can package them. Maybe the gentleman at the back, I think he had his hand first, and we'll come back. Yes. You have the mic, you take it wherever you want. And we'll come this side next.
Thank you, sir. Do you think it's possible, or how do you think it's possible, to have an agreement between the Palestinian and the State of Israel when the State of Palestinian, or until the State of Palestine, basically doesn't agree that Israel should exist, period. How can we have an
I
agreement?
didn't quite hear the.
Can there be an agreement as long as the other side does not believe on Israel's right to exist?
Correct.
Did I do a fair job?
Yes, thank you.
Right.
We'll take one here if it can be from a student, and we'll do another round. Whoever has the mic and, okay, yes.
Do you perceive any
We have
Cultural-
more experienced students too. Yes, please go ahead.
do you perceive any cultural differences between a Western way of thought and a Middle Eastern way of thought as at the core of the difficulty of understanding what it means for both sides to compromise? Is that a key factor in the difficulty in addressing the conflict in the Middle East?
So 3 questions.
What was this question?
If I understood it right, are there cultural differences between the West and the Middle East which make this more intractable?
Yeah.
That, of course, and the question of this,
Yeah.
whether the other side believes in the right to exist,
Okay.
and is
Yeah.
Bob Dole possible again?
Okay, I'll take the deans first. When I was elected majority leader by the Democrats in the Senate, who were then in the majority, the first person I called was Bob Dole. He was then the Republican leader, had been the majority leader, was about to become the minority leader. And I asked if I could go to see him. He agreed, and I went to see him. And I said to him, you, Senator Dole, have been here for nearly 30 years. I've only been here a couple of years. You know more about the Senate than I will ever know. But in just a few years I've been here, I've come to be aware that if the two leaders, you and I, don't trust each other, what is already a difficult job becomes impossible. It's very, very hard to get anything done in the Senate, and done near impossible when the two leaders don't trust each other. So I said to him, I've come to tell you how I intend to behave towards you and ask if you will reciprocate. And I set forth, there was nothing in writing, I set forth the most basic, simple standards of decency, fair play, honesty, and he was delighted. We shook hands. To this moment, never once has a harsh word passed between Bob Dole and me, in public or in private. We disagreed almost every day on the vast majority of bills that came before us. We negotiated vigorously, extensively, every day that the Senate was in session. We often reached agreement, as on the Americans with Disabilities Act, on the massive clean air legislation, on, relevant today, an assault weapons ban that we passed in 1994. And when we disagreed, we went out and stood in the well of the Senate and argued our point of view without making it personal, without insulting the other person, and sticking to the issues. And as I said, we are still close friends.
What happened then?
Well, that would take a really long, I'll come back next year and give the Dean Ann Cobb Memorial speech. But I'll try to be brief. But basically, the amount of money going into American politics has multiplied dramatically. In April 2016, 60 Minutes carried a segment which featured a Republican congressman from Tampa, Florida, who described the process of indoctrination that he received his first week. And to be fair, both sides do the same thing. And what he was told basically is, you're here to raise money. They gave him a card. The Republican leadership gave him a card of a sample day in office. 4 hours on the telephone raising money, 1 hour on legislation, 1 hour meeting your constituents. The amount of money pouring into our system now is extraordinary, completely out of proportion to what it was as recently as 20 years ago, and unaccountable. The decisions by the Supreme Court in a series of cases the most prominent is called Citizens United, have opened the floodgates. At the same time, that accountability has vanished. The argument, the defenders of Citizens United say, sunlight is a great disinfectant. Anybody should be able to give whatever they want as long as the public knows it. But the increase in contributions has been accompanied by the vanishing of accountability. There's not a person in this room, in this country, who knows how much was given and by whom in the presidential campaign and the related congressional campaigns of 2016, and it will increase dramatically this year and most so in 2020, and you'll never know who gave what to whom. And that has, the American system has been corrupted, not in the sense of a guy comes in and says, oh, Senator, I'll give you $10,000 or $100,000 if you vote with me, in the sense that the bond of trust between the American people and their elected representatives has been severed. I'm going to ask a question of you that I ask of audiences all over America for 10 years. How many of you believe that members of Congress are more responsive to their constituents than they are to their donors? Well, I asked that question for years and not a hand went up. And then the first time a hand went up was a couple of years ago in the suburbs of Washington, and a woman put her hand up. And I was really surprised because nobody had ever done that before. So I didn't say anything. I waited till after the event. I went up to her. I said, listen, I don't want to embarrass you, but I have to see you're the only person in America who's ever raised your hand. So I have to ask you why. She said, it's very simple. My husband's a member of Congress. And that was it. And democracy can't function effectively when the people don't believe in their elected representatives. As your non-response demonstrates, people don't believe in them. And a second one, now in the process, I think, of being slightly corrected, is gerrymandering. Now, gerrymandering is named after a Massachusetts politician who lived at the time of the American Revolution, so it's been around a long time. Technology is neutral. It can serve beneficial ends, it can serve negative ends. And technology has encouraged the use of gerrymandering in a manner without precedent in our history. Democrats did it in 2000 when they controlled a majority of the state legislatures. In Illinois, in a suburban Chicago district, the Democrats changed this district to take his house out of the congressional district. Used to be on county lines and city lines. Now you can take a house and move it out of a district. Between 2000 and 2010, technology had advanced more than it had in the previous 100 years, and the Republicans in 2010 gerrymandered in a way so that in Pennsylvania, in Michigan, in North Carolina, and other states, Republicans received less than 50% of the vote in House races and won more than 2/3 of the seats. And that election just yesterday in Pennsylvania, that district is disappearing because the Pennsylvania Supreme Court is redrawing the map. Hopefully that'll happen. You take those two in combination and you get what you got now. A system that is undemocratic, unrepresentative, in which the American people do not trust their elected representatives. They, in turn, are consumed in a never-ending search for money.
The other questions about
Yes.
right to exist and
Yes.
Is this cultural?
Well, first, I respectfully but firmly disagree with the premise of your question. You said the Palestinians do not accept Israel's right to exist. That is true as to Hamas. It is not true as to the Palestinian Authority. President Abbas courageously, 25 years ago, stood in Gaza and said he was opposed to violence. He recognizes Israel. He believes in Israel's right to exist. He accepts all prior agreements. And he has largely, not entirely, lived up to that. The fact of the matter is, one of the principal problems in the West Bank, now controlled by the Palestinian Authority, is the manner in which their police forces operate to suppress Hamas to prevent attacks on Israel. Many of the attacks on Israel out of the Palestinian territories have come from the 2/3 of the land area of the west of the Palestinian territories that are controlled by Israeli security forces, not by Palestinian security forces. And so he has suppressed them. When I was there as an envoy, I regularly received delegations of human rights groups from Amnesty and the various others complaining about the aggressive practices of the Palestinian Authority police forces in suppressing Hamas in the West Bank. Now, the problem is that they haven't been able to consolidate control over the entire Palestinian territories, and the point you made is applicable as to Hamas in Gaza. I always felt that in one respect, I could try to replicate Northern Ireland and the Palestinian territories. When the negotiations in Northern Ireland began, Sinn Féin, the largest, at that time the second, now the largest political party among nationalists or Catholics, was not in the talks because the governments had a policy of excluding those political parties that had paramilitaries engaged in violence. It's a long, separate story, but we finally persuaded them to come in. And I believe one of the reasons they came in is they thought that, in a colloquial term, the train might be leaving the station without them. And I always felt if we could get a credible process going between the Palestinian Authority and the government of Israel, that would be the time when Hamas might be willing to accept the conditions that the United States and others imposed: commitment to nonviolence, acceptance of Israel's right to exist, and acceptance of prior agreements. We never get to that stage, and we won't know.
And the last question, is there something about culture of Middle East that just makes this more difficult?
It's clear cultural differences are huge. They do have an effect. We see the effects in our own country in the enormous disputes over immigration. We see the difficulties of assimilation we have had in our own country, the most open, the first true meritocracy, the most pluralistic country in the world. We've had enormous problems in accepting and assimilating people who look different, speak different, act different. So imagine in places where they don't have the same attitudes or approaches or ideals that we have. It is a very huge factor.
If we can take one more round, and we really do need the first question by a student because the senator needs to go and tell Carrie Messinas?
Carrie Messina.
Yes, that she made the right choice.
Yeah,
so get the mic to a student so that we can prove that. we have some hands here. Get a student you choose.
Hi, my name is Margot Blank. I'm a student here at BU. I'm wondering what you think the impact of Benjamin Netanyahu's embrace of Donald Trump and also his corruption charges have on Israel's global legitimacy.
I can't hear too well. The acoustic's not too good coming this way. Here's my translator.
Repeat briefly. I can, but this one might come better from you.
You're okay. So Benjamin Netanyahu has not only embraced Donald Trump as a presidential candidate and also as a president, but he's also been accused of corruption. And I'm wondering what you think those two factors have in terms of an effect on Israel's legitimacy around the world.
So Benjamin Netanyahu, very close to Trump, right, and including in the election,
yes,
and B, the corruption charges against Prime Minister Netanyahu,
right,
and how does that impact his legitimacy in this process at this point of time? Israel,
yeah. I am unable to comment on the charges because I know only what I've read in the paper, and I myself am a former state U.S. attorney and federal judge, so I have long disciplined myself not to make comments on allegations or pending charges. I don't think it's had enormous effect in his relationship with President Trump, which is a very close one. I think the greater challenge for him is with his own society. The extent to which it may be eroding his authority is hard to know. His party appears to be standing firmly behind him. It's an unusual system. The Attorney General who will make the decision on whether to indict the prime minister was appointed by the prime minister. So you talk about a guy that's in a tough spot. He's got to make this very difficult decision. I don't know what it will
add
be.
a conceptual wrinkle to this, because the Israeli prime minister's relationship to President Obama, especially towards the end, was clearly not very strong.
Yes.
How do these relationships impact, how much do they impact the potential of whatever happens in a negotiation or a peace process when you either get too close or so obviously not close?
I don't think in the end that the personal relationship between the president and the prime minister has a major or long-lasting effect. In fact, there have been very, very sharp differences between presidents and prime ministers going all the way back to the time when Israel was created. In my book, I described when in the 1950s, when there were Israel, France, and Britain militarily seized control of the Suez Canal, President Eisenhower refused to talk to Prime Minister Ben-Gurion. And he said he wouldn't talk to him until the Israeli troops were drawn, and he threatened that the United States would go to the United Nations and seek condemnation of Israel unless they withdrew, and they did. The worst dispute was between Ronald Reagan and Menachem Begin. There's a famous incident of when Reagan was about to announce his plan, and he had his U.S. ambassador go. Begin was on vacation with his wife, and he told Begin, and Begin exploded in anger and attacked, criticized Reagan. And Reagan announced the plan, and it was dead by the time it left his mouth. So there's been a lot of disagreement. I do want to take 1 minute, though, to make a case that is not made much, and I accept that many people here will not accept it. But I think that while President Obama did not do all he should have done, I feel, for example, when he went to Cairo to speak to the Muslim world early in his presidency, he should have gone to Jerusalem at the same time. He didn't. But in terms of substance, the Israeli military, security, and intelligence services all stated that the cooperative relationship between the United States and Israel during the Obama administration was the best it had been in the history of the two countries. It's very good now, too, so it doesn't mean it's not good now. Secondly, the amount of funding provided by the United States to Israel was increased by Obama to the highest level it's ever been. Thirdly, Obama personally authorized an additional expenditure of $250 million to Israel to expedite final development and deployment of the Iron Dome anti-missile system, which is so crucial to Israel's defense. So while it is true he and the prime minister didn't get along, the military, intelligence, and security services got along at the best level they ever have.
We'll take maybe one more question. I'll let the people who have the mic choose because the light is in my eye, but who has the mic now? She said right up, okay, there it goes.
Hi, my name is Connor Mooney, and I'm a student here at BU. And this actually isn't my question. It's a question from my father, who's currently asleep in Dublin. It's about the Irish peace process. It reads, 20 years after the Good Friday Agreement was signed, people are still worried if the peace process will come to an end. What are your thoughts on the current situation with Brexit, now added to the mix, that might result in border checks being reestablished? Is it time once again for outside moderators?
The question is about
Brexit.
What is
will it last? Will the Irish agreement last? Let me take one more, and then we'll one more here, and we'll make the.
I'm good. You can take more than one.
Teresa, maybe right up front here. Right up front. Yes.
Hi. I have one question. So do you think that the settlements is making the two-state solution a less viable option, and do you think it's an obstacle to peace?
Okay. So the two questions are, one is, will the Irish agreement last, and what is the impact of Brexit? And the other is, are the settlements
Yeah.
And this is, of course, about the Middle East, making a solution difficult or impossible. Was that fair? Okay.
Yeah. Okay. On Brexit, the decision by the UK to leave the European Union was democratically taken, a free and fair election in a democratic society, and therefore must be respected in my judgment. But just about every political saying is attributed to Churchill, and another one is that he was supposed to have said is that democracy guarantees a fair process, not a good result. I think we can all agree with that. So Brexit...
They really want to clap on that one.
No.
They should.
I believe that Brexit was an extraordinarily unwise decision, which could have, depending upon the ultimate agreement between the UK and the EU, have severe adverse effects on the people of the United Kingdom, and even more severe effects on the people of Ireland. Because the economy of Ireland is deeply integrated into that of the United Kingdom, to an extent that is comparable or perhaps even more intense than the Canadian into the US economy.
But severe enough, given his father's question, severe enough to threaten the agreement.
I'm getting to that, yes. So,
my apologies.
The point is that if Ireland is, the country of Ireland is economically destabilized as a result of the agreement, that will have an adverse effect upon the situation in the north. The second is the reintroduction of a hard border will have severe adverse effects on the situation in the north and could potentially have harmful effects on the peace process, although one cannot state that with any certainty because there are so many other factors that are intersecting at the same time. But just a couple of points. Each year there are 6 million liters of raw milk produced in Northern Ireland. They are shipped across the border into the Republic of Ireland, where it's all processed into yogurt, cheese, and other dairy products, and then redistributed, sold into the UK, including Northern Ireland. That's one small example of an entire economy. And so you could have tremendous economic disruption, and the history of conflict is that economic downturns, economic difficulties, the lack of opportunity, the lack of jobs, is a precursor, is a contributor to violent conflict. That's what happened in Northern Ireland. That's what's happened everywhere where conflicts occur. Economic factors underlie everything, although they are never the exclusive factors and frequently not the triggering event. When there was a hard border, when I first went there, I was shocked to learn that very, very few people from Northern Ireland, even those who lived a mile or two from the border, had ever crossed the border into Ireland. And the reverse was true. And that allowed the perpetuation of deeply unfair demonization and stereotyping. Most of the Protestants in Northern Ireland thought of the Republic of Ireland as it had existed 50 years ago. They thought the priests ran everything. They controlled the government. The priest was like the mayor of every town. I mean, it was a fantasy. It's an Ireland that disappeared, if it ever existed, in the mists of history. But for them, it was alive. And for the Protestants, the Catholics in the Republic, they thought of the North as it existed 50, 70, 80 years ago, when a prime minister stood before the Parliament and said, "Ours is a government of Protestants for Protestants." So the removal of the militarization of the border has had a dramatic effect on economics, on social intercourse, on attitudes. They go back and forth. It's common now for someone to go to Northern Ireland, to go to Dublin for the weekend, to go to Belfast. I mean, it's kind of incredible, you think, the way they lived before. So yes, it will have a severe adverse effect. Now, here's the problem. Both the UK and the EU have already publicly committed themselves to not restoring a hard border and to have some kind of a special carve-out for Ireland. But it is an illustration of the truth of the axiom that it's much easier to promise to do something than it is to actually do it. And they're having a hard time figuring out how they can carry out the promises, because in many respects they have made contradictory promises. And if you do one, you say no to the other, and vice versa. I hope they'll work it out, because a lot is at stake. The other question was about settlements. Settlements are plainly an obstacle to peace in the region. But I believe that both sides have erred in their policy with respect to settlements. The Israelis, by continuing the settlements at an accelerating rate, reducing the likelihood of there ever being able to be a geographically contiguous Palestinian state. Keep in mind that the settlement policy began in Israel as a military defensive measure against the threat of an invasion across the Jordan River from the east. That's what Israelis had known when the United Nations proposed partition in late 1947. Israel, after bitter internal debate, accepted it. It would have created a Palestinian state. It would have made Jerusalem an international city, and the Israelis accepted it. The Palestinians, the Arabs, rejected it. There were only 600,000 Jews in what is now Israel then. The Arab populations totaled tens of millions, and the governments thought they could easily defeat the Israelis because there was a United States military embargo. There were no arms coming from the United States to Israel then. They got their arms surreptitiously from the Czech Skoda military works, which had been a part of the Soviet Union. So the Israelis accepted, the Arabs rejected, 6 Arab countries invaded Israel, and of course we saw what happened. Israel defeated them because the Arabs didn't cooperate among each other. When Ben-Gurion was asked, how can you be so confident? We are so few, they are so many. He said, we have a secret weapon. And the reporter said, what's a secret weapon? He said, the Arabs. And that's what happened, not only in that war, but in the succeeding wars. Now, fast forward. When we went there, President Obama proposed a full settlement freeze. For that, he was harshly criticized in Israel and in the United States, even though many of those who criticized him said nothing when George W. Bush made the identical proposal, identical words, 5 years earlier. So it plainly was, in large part, a political reaction. I did the negotiating with the Israeli government, trying to get a full settlement freeze. We couldn't get it, but we got an agreement by Israel to discontinue the construction of new housing for 10 months in the territories. And the Palestinians rejected it. And President Abbas said to me, we can't negotiate while settlement construction is going on, even though he had just finished 2 years of negotiating with Ehud Olmert while there was settlement construction going on, unrestricted. Now, I said the reason earlier. He didn't want to negotiate because he didn't trust Netanyahu. So when we presented it in a meeting in New York, the Palestinian reaction expressed by Saeb Erekat in front of Abbas to President Obama, with me present, was, this is worse than useless. And they refused to enter the talks then. 9 months later, when there was 1 month to go in the moratorium, they agreed to talks. But the condition they imposed on the talks was that the moratorium be extended. Now they said it was indispensable. And I asked him, how does something go from being worse than useless to indispensable in 9 months? And in fact, they withdrew from the talks. So and look, Arafat negotiated while settlements were under construction. Abbas negotiated while settlements were under construction. This is a new construct, which Abbas sought to pin the blame on Obama because Obama had requested it, when in fact, as I said earlier, Bush had requested the identical proposal 5 years earlier, wasn't attained, Abbas still negotiated. So I believe that the Israeli policy, which of course has been completely altered from its initial intention of a secure border area with settlements being like a tripwire, to one of completely blanketing the West Bank in a plain effort to isolate Jerusalem, to make it impossible for the Palestinians to have a capital in that area, and to make it very difficult to have ever a contiguous geographic state. But I believe the Palestinians have only harmed themselves by refusing to negotiate. In the one time we got them together under President Obama, because the moratorium wouldn't be extended. So I think both have contributed to the impasse, and I hope that the policies of both change. The Israelis should halt settlement construction, but the Palestinians should not use that construction as an excuse not to negotiate. I said to President Abbas, you're sitting here, I'm sitting with him. You're telling me you won't negotiate because settlements are being constructed. And every day that you delay negotiating, more settlements are constructed. If you get into negotiations, you can get an agreement on the border. That will define what is Israel and what is Palestine, and you can build anything you want on your side of the line, and Israelis can build anything they want on their side. And if you look at the Clinton parameters, with the land swaps to accommodate the large concentrations of Israeli population that would have to be included in Israel, with parallel land swaps to Palestinians, with sufficient assistance in building new cities for the people who will be coming there, I think the answer is in sight. I really do. And I think both have contributed on opposite sides of the settlement issue to delaying getting that agreement.
Senator, before we thank you for this wonderful evening, maybe a last speculative question in an attempt to end on a positive note. You gave us hope by saying there is no such thing as a conflict that cannot be resolved. And then you gave us an assessment that you do not see in the near term a solution.
Right.
In your fantasy world, not the Trump call though, what could possibly change in the realm of the possible in the region that might prove the first axiom and bring closer the second time frame?
Yeah. Well, first, life is unpredictable. Not many people thought Trump would be elected, and he was. And it's changed our country, and it's changed our policies toward the world. We can debate whether it's for the good or better. I have my own views on that. So you can't tell what's going to happen. Secondly, whatever happens in Netanyahu's corruption trials, and whatever happens with Abbas, they're not going to be in office forever. In fact, there's a reasonable chance that they're both going to be not in office in a relatively near future. We don't know who's going to succeed them. We don't know whether in this respect there'll be an improvement or not an improvement. Thirdly, I believe that societies like individuals ultimately act out of self-interest. It takes some people a little longer than others to correctly identify their self-interest, but finally they come to it. And I think a continuation of the current situation is very, very dangerous for Israel. I mentioned the broader statistics earlier. Let me discuss the immediate statistics. First, in the region, there are now about 400 million Arabs, about 1.8 billion Muslims. In 2050, there will be nearly 3.5 billion Muslims, and about 700 million of them will be Arab. The number of Jews, meanwhile, in Israel, according to Israeli population projections, will go from approximately 8 million to about 12 million. That's on the high side of the estimate. It doesn't make any sense for Israel to continue in a state of war with its neighbors. And you can see now the dynamics in the Middle East changing. You can see the Saudi Arabians going through internal change and policy change as they reach out to Israel in yet quiet and unpublicized actions, recognizing that both countries have the identical principal foreign policy objective, which is the containment of Iran's drive for hegemony in the region. And it makes absolutely no sense for them not to be cooperating that. But they can't do it. Much as they'd like to, the Saudis can't do it until the Palestinian issue is resolved. And the same is true of the others. And the Palestinian issue can't be resolved without all of the leaders of the Muslim world consenting because of the issue of Jerusalem. The Palestinians have a free hand to negotiate on borders, on territory, on the right of return. They do not have a free hand on Jerusalem. Jerusalem, the final disposition of Jerusalem, Saudis will have to get the support of the Saudis, the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Moroccans, and others in the Muslim world. And the powder keg that exists there now, with all of the volatility in the region, if you ask an Israeli military intelligence official how important to Israel's security are the agreements that you have with Egypt and Israel, they would say of paramount importance. They have said it. They say it to this day. And an agreement with the Palestinians would rank right up there with them. And keep in mind, the Israelis reached agreement with the Palestinians in 1979, and with the Jordanians when Clinton was president. It won't be a perfect agreement. Neither side will be completely happy. There will be some friction, but there can be no doubt that an agreement is possible. But they must see it to be in their self-interest before they will take that step. And I hope and pray that they will, for both of their benefits.
Thank you for that profound note. Right after the event, hold it for just 1 second. Right after the event, I'm going to ask the senator to sign my poster. But I would like you to sign George Mitchell, because I've liked George Mitchell more than Henry Kissinger.
Okay.
Always.
Well,
Thank you, Senator, for your humor, for your candor, and for your wisdom.
are you doing that in an effort to discourage others from asking that, or to encourage them?
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.